Yo,
Howdy.
hey, how are you
Hey,
doing?
hey. I am doing well. Sorry for the delay in calling you.
Ah, you're good, man. Um, I have gotten a message from our mutual friend Cirrus, calling you a degen and saying that his subathon is still going, and that you are to come on at some point. That's my
Yeah,
opening.
I believe I made that promise. Cirrus is well aware of the fact that I take forever to respond to messages though, so I'm sure they've not taken this personally.
Yeah. Um, he and I talked a little bit about this. He said that he mentioned to you he was also interested in talking to you about the subject, like the anti-theism thing. Um, so you know, uh, but yeah, I guess do we want to jump right into it or
Yeah,
what?
hit
Like,
it up.
what's your cool?
Kill me.
Um, yeah. So I guess the first thing that I want to open with basically is getting a sense of your position with respect to anti-theism. We haven't talked a whole lot about this. I've seen you talk to other people about it, but I'm not sure like what your stance is. Like, if you're describing yourself as an anti-theist, what does that mean?
I just don't like any kind of mysticism or superstition.
Okay.
I don't think we can make any prescriptive statements on metaphysics outside of the ones that are necessary for basic cognition. So like the metaphysical belief in causality, the reliability of our senses, that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
You have to make those leaps, otherwise you literally can't participate in the world. You would just have to die if you can't accept those
Right.
things.
We both agree solipsism is not necessarily the most helpful position, I guess,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So
Like,
to
yeah.
avoid that, I mean, anything beyond that, right? You can make basic assumptions, but any metaphysical stuff outside of that, I completely reject. Because I think it leads people into really dangerous positions where they're
Okay.
capable of making rational utilitarian um conclusions based
Mhm.
on information that I don't think is real. So like for example, if a person believes in some kind of metaphysical thing, like a spirit or like a deity, with a given set of values or principles, beliefs, something about the world that isn't empirically testable, it's possible that they could arrive at a rational conclusion about the world that I would consider immoral based on information they have that I can't argue them out of. You can't argue a person out of like a metaphysical belief unless you're willing to do that whole like here's a different interpretation of the Bible type deal. And that's not like a reliable process, especially if a person's not an adherent to a like a major structured religion. It could just be kind of a crapshoot on how much their positions can actually be moved.
Okay. Um, so is this a position that you have like a policy position on? Like, is there anti-theist policies that you would want to enact, or is there like, um, or is this just like a rhetorical point
No,
that's on
I'm
your?
pro freedom of religion. I don't think it should
Okay.
be extended to any kind of state persecution. Um,
So
yeah, but
I
I mean,
guess
it's like more of an ethical thing, I guess.
okay. So like I guess my feeling on anti-theism is that if it's a position that in which enacting any policy relating to it would be like a violation of human rights, why do you subscribe to the position? Like, because I get kind of like where you're going with respect to um I see like your position, but I'm wondering that I guess how do you get there?
Well, it's a
If there's no policy position that you can get with it, then that without violating human rights, then why would you subscribe to that position rather than going some other route?
Because well, I think it's a cultural shift. I feel the same way about like gender abolitionism. I don't think you can policy your way over to that point. I think you need to kind
Gotcha.
of socially discourage some avenues. I don't think there's any practical or ethical way to enforce anti-theism through the state. I don't. I think like we have micro experiments of this in like the Soviet and Mao's China's bans on religion. Like the
Right.
state atheism type thing, but like it didn't really change anything. Functionally, it didn't change anything even for the people who deconverted, because for those who didn't practice their religion in secret, a lot of them just started adopting mantras of the state with a religious fervor. So it ended up not really changing anything. It's like a long-term cultural project.
So I guess if you're gonna have like that kind of this isn't necessarily where I was planning on going, but like if you're gonna have that kind of behavior, what's your goal with anti-theism then? Like, what's the end result that you're wanting to go for there?
Same as with gender abolitionism. It's just something that I care about ethically. I don't think that it's possible to like vote in a guy who will make a big change or whatever.
Okay.
It's like a guiding set of principles, right? Because there are lots of things that I think are bad that we shouldn't do that I also don't think you can really legislate against. Like a lot
Sure.
for like a lot of abusive behavior that you would do to a partner. The only stuff that crosses the threshold into like potentially illegal, like goes into like physical abuse or financial crimes. But
Mhm.
you can never make gaslighting illegal. That'd be insane. Can you imagine trying to run
Yeah,
that
no,
by?
I feel that. Yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. So it's like
Yeah.
you can't meaningfully legislate on that. But obviously, like, culturally, we can still move towards the idea that you should treat your partner with respect.
So I guess let me get into my position then on anti-theism, because I think that I'm in opposition to largely what you've expressed. I think that your position is a little bit more reasonable than what I've heard some people say. So I've encountered a number of different perspectives on anti-theism, one of which would be like the lowering the number of religious people in the world and elevating the number of atheists in the world, for example. And I think that that gets into dodgy territory. Does that describe where you're at, or does that not describe where you're at?
I mean, through a cultural project, right? There are people making the choice to not be religious or the rejection of religious principles or any kind of spiritualism, but not through any
Yeah,
like state project. I mean, ideally, I would want to live in a fully secular world, yeah, but I don't even know if that's necessarily possible. Just in like
I
a
don't either.
yeah, like
Yeah,
a mathematical sense. And I think any attempt to do so through policy or force would be more destructive than whatever benefits you could possibly extract from it.
yeah. So I think that also the cultural enforcement issue winds up being not just as bad. It's just a different form of the same problem. Because you wind up just like shaming people arbitrarily. I think that uh, let me suggest like a different approach, because I think that anti-theism stands in contrast to another social strategy of pluralism. Um, and I think that that's a better approach when it comes down to coalition building. I think that when anti-theism is kind of like a scorched earth approach, and because when you're setting yourself up as an anti to something, it's going to result in like toxic behavior. And the question with that is going to be, is the toxicity that that kind of cultural narrative promotes, is that going to be hitting the kind of people that you want to hit with that toxicity? So for example, if you're an anti-fascist, you're going to be hitting fascists with toxicity. What's bad about that? Fucking nothing. So okay, fine. If you're with an anti-theist position, though, you do wind up hitting a bunch of theists with toxicity. And if you're interested in coalition building, that's going to be hitting a lot of people that are like on your side on most issues, with everything except for like their religious belief.
Well, I agree that
So
for coalition building, it's always a better idea to spread the net as far as possible.
mhm,
But obviously, there have to be considerations within that, right? Like,
yeah,
so I believe in coalition building with people, like lots of people with moral positions that I disagree with. I mean,
right.
I've gotten in trouble with the left for believing like should like edgy libertarian leaning kind of racist white dudes have an opportunity to join the left on some issues? Like, yeah, absolutely, because better to have them on our side than not. But I wouldn't then think like, well, we shouldn't exclude or criticize those ideas because it could be more effective to coalition build with them.
Sure.
And I do think that spiritual thinking is harmful. I just think it's indirectly harmful.
Okay.
It's not harmful for what it is; it's harmful for what it enables. So it doesn't necessarily fit, because how often when it comes to like coalition building do you consider metaphysics, right? It's a little it's kind of a unique case. The whole like issue with religiosity. And my goal isn't necessarily to like shame people, because you can't shame people out of religion. God, maybe one in 1,000. I don't know. That's not reliable. Um, but it's so consider it like a non-pragmatic position to hold. But I still think it's important. Like you still have to keep your end goals in mind, right? Um, and that stuff's
So
pretty
why like
dangerous.
okay. Um I think that when you're talking about an end goal that is like entirely secular, that winds up being like a, effectively cultural genocide at that point, because you're looking at an end goal of eliminating indigenous practices, several religions across the world of various types.
Yes.
Um, ultimately, right? Like it winds up being like a colonial position.
Sure. I mean, there are
Okay.
plenty of other things that I want like culturally eradicated, like patriarchal tribal structures. I think those are pretty
Okay.
unethical. I mean, if that means eventually the stigmatization of a bunch of indigenous cultures, then yeah, go for it. Yeah, there are plenty of cultures or cultural elements that I think need to be
And just
critiqued.
spiritual belief is one of those for you.
Yeah.
Okay. So My position on that is when you're looking at, I, I'm a big fan of looking at religion kind of like in a rational way. And I think that somebody can be a theist and rational and an atheist and rational. And I think that that's exemplified by the number of people that are in philosophy of religion who are on both sides of this issue. And so when you're looking at like an end goal and saying spiritual beliefs bad, I think that in order to have that kind of thing, you need to show that like the spiritual belief is the reason why it's bad. And I don't think that's the case. I think that the cause usually when we're criticizing religion is in some other place other than mere God belief, rather than um, something else like somebody being an authoritarian and being religious as well, and then utilizing that religion for authoritarian purposes, for example.
Well, the issue is that if a person's bad behavior is rooted in some way in a spiritual or metaphysical justification, there's literally nothing you can do to argue them out of it. It becomes completely impossible unless you want to adopt their own moon logic and just take a roll of the dice and hope that their brain ends up like reconciling those new pieces of information in a way that's
Mhm.
favorable to you. But there's no real way around it. I mean, a big example of this right now would be the fact that a huge, like a block with a ton of political power in this country is fundamentalist Christians. And
Right.
fundamentalist Christians often believe that the global warming isn't anthropogenic, it's caused by God as part of the end times that predicate the rapture. And the rapture is something they're looking forward to. They have been for a very long time. So they either don't care about or actively kind of root on climate change, something that would kill hundreds of millions of people charitably, um, because it suits their metaphysical, like morals. And there's nothing I can do to push them out of that outside of like pulling out a Bible and hoping that I can like beat them to death with the right scripture, like actually, no, not that, not that. But you can't really
Yeah, yeah,
argue
yeah.
them out of it. And that's very dangerous. Religion gives a supernatural pretext to existing justifications. It allows people to dress up irrational arguments and make them rational through the addition of extra factors that can only be justified metaphysically. Stuff like that is really, really, really dangerous. And that to me is the underlying issue. There are smart religious people and rational religious people. Einstein was, religious. There's a lot of that. But the religiosity is always itself irrational, much in the same way that intelligence is highly compartmentalized. You can
My
have people who are very smart. Um,
one second, my chat is freaking out at me and saying
okay,
we skipped introductions. Um,
I'm
so
Vaush.
yeah, I hear your point and I want to address them, and we might have to retread that ground a little bit. But I do want to let, I guess, all y'all know I am pagan. I'm not a Christian. So I'm a polytheist YouTuber that does a lot of content around paganism and philosophy and that kind of stuff. So I'm here, and I make a lot of the same criticisms that you just made against certain forms of religion and even paganism.
But it's the
So
logic, right? It's the spiritualism underlying it all. Even if you change the religion itself, the belief in any kind of spiritual or metaphysical like force that can't be empirically accounted for. I mean, then you could justify whatever. Believing in a soul, for example, is very dangerous. If a person believes in a soul or reincarnation or an afterlife or whatever, their weight on death is going to be very different than what a secular person's weight on death is going to be. That's a moral calculation that just gets totally fucked up by the introduction of a lot of, mystical shit.
so okay. Um as far as soul belief, wait, were you saying is a problematic part of soul belief?
Well, it necessarily cheapens death. It has
Okay.
to, because now it means that it's not an end to everything. If you believe in reincarnation, you might think killing an unfortunate person might actually be morally right because you're sparing them that life and sending them to another one.
Okay. So I've got a couple of distractions going on. I guess as far as like the soul is concerned, I'm heathen. I hold that the soul is in multiple parts and that as one dies, that breaks apart and it can be considered the end. I'm not necessarily against the idea of like reincarnation or any of that kind of shit. And, but at the same time, I don't see that as necessarily like a harmful belief. One of the things that I got into with respect to history on the belief of the soul and afterlife and that kind of shit. I'm agnostic on the afterlife. I don't think that you can reasonably. Afterlife is different than even God belief, in my opinion. I think that there's less of a case for afterlife than there is of a case for deities. But at the same time, I think that I don't have an issue with traditionally holding to an afterlife view of some sort.
But it's
That
dangerous,
being
right? Like
said,
you could be like
well,
really
no,
dangerous if you're
I
convinced.
don't think that it's dangerous inherently. I think that you can wind up creating a dangerous narratives around it, though. And I
Why
think that
not
that's
just
true with a
abandon it?
lot of things. And
Well,
I think that if you start saying that you're against everything, that in order to have that, if you're against everything that can have dangerous narratives around it, you're going to be banning a hell, or not banning, but you're going to be trying to be culturally against a hell of a lot more than religion. Politics, for example, politics is something you can build tons of dangerous narratives around. You can build dangerous narratives around the organization of government.
well, wait, but
That's an,
the
you
difference
know,
isn't just can it be used for bad?
mhm.
It's can it produce in a person a conclusion that can't be argued against? So
Yes,
for a
politics,
political,
hell yeah.
well, no, because as long as a person is basing all their judgments off of empirics and your axioms are aligned, you can reason people out of arguments theoretically. But if a person believes there's a God and believes that God is telling them to kill, there's no moral argument you can make against that person. There's no benefit to
I
believing
disagree with that.
in the
So
spiritual. There's not like a thing you get that you don't get through rational or empirical thought, but you do gain the ability to obfuscate real empirical moral judgments
mhm.
with spiritual factors.
So historically, we do have some kind of like gates that are built up around that kind of subject. And there's a couple of historical thinkers that I want to kind of toss your way with respect to this conversation. And I think that this is where I get anti-theism doesn't necessarily work as much as a pluralist approach. That if you're going to be criticizing religion and taking a pluralist standard, you're going to be able to criticize those things in a way that is going to appeal to people that maybe even are ignoring empiricism in some way, which I'd argue that most people do anyway. I think that if you're outside of religion, there's a lot of people that will say that they are into empiricism, but generally aren't.
That's true.
Most people, a lot of people don't think rationally generally. That's my opinion. And I think that irrational or irrational narratives can appeal to people who aren't religious or are religious. It's the religion part doesn't necessarily predict one way or the other. But if you hold a pluralist narrative and say instead of an anti-theist narrative, then you're going to be able to start building standards with respect to how we engage with other people. Somebody saying that their God wants them to kill other people is going to be anti-pluralist. So if we're thinking with a pluralist approach, then that person can easily be ethically argued out if they're in a society that
what ethical
strengthens
principles?
pluralism. So pluralism is a set of here. I'm going to send these
So
to you on Discord. I've got
but
there's
well,
this.
I'm familiar with the concept. The problem is that you're building a house on a rotting foundation. Like you can arbitrarily develop a set of moral beliefs that align with
Mhm.
mine through religiosity, but I don't really value those beliefs that you've arrived at because they're built on shaky ground. Depending on
Okay,
what your
so the
spiritual
things that I want
beliefs
to send
are,
you about pluralism are constructed by an atheist activist.
that's fine. I'll still disagree with them.
Why?
Well,
They're holding it without any. It's an ethical system.
I don't have
I
to
think that
agree with
the
a person
criticisms
just
that you're
because they're
putting
an
forward
atheist.
putting forward against religion are ethical,
No,
right?
no, the problem
So,
they're not ethical. It's not that religious people are necessarily less ethical. It's the
mhm.
system. They've opened themselves up to non-empirical information. They trust things based on faith. As soon as you start doing that, you introduce factors into ethical decision making that can't be accounted for and can't be reasoned against. There's no like backbone to it. I think a lot of people are irrational, even secular people. I recognize that, but there are
Yeah,
ways to address that through education. You can't counter with religiosity education because even if a person is highly educated, a religious belief that aligns them with different sets of axioms, or God forbid, if they're one of those types who thinks that anything God does is necessarily ethical, it wouldn't
yeah. I
matter how
think that
smart they are.
this is a problem that will show up where I'll agree with you with respect to criticism of religion in this regard, but I think that it's something that it shows up with respect to specific religions that have supremacy narratives.
But it's fine
That
even if they don't, it's still a problem.
I see. This is where I disagree. That if you have a religion that doesn't have a supremacy narrative, a lot of the things that you're talking about wind up going by the wayside. There's like things
Depends
that
on
just don't
what do they
show up.
believe.
I'm a for my particular manifestation of religion, right? I don't engage in a supremacy narrative. You can be an atheist, that's fine. I can be heathen, that's fine.
But
That's
what do
not
you
necessarily an
believe that
issue.
contradicts empirical reality? What additional, what
As far as like
deviances?
contradicting it, no. I think that empiricism is a useful tool for engaging with reality, just like I think that there are other useful tools for engaging with reality.
And what
If we're
exists
looking at
above it?
history, like for example, if you're looking at history, you're going to be engaging with history in different assumptions that aren't necessarily empirical in order to build a narrative with information.
The difference is that those are analytical methods that are meant to provide
Right.
us understanding of something empirical, whereas religion, superstition adds just like there's it's not analysis to believe there are like spirits or fairies or whatever. That's just an
Right. I
extra
think that,
thing that a person believes.
and I'm against superstition, but I'm against superstition in a way that the Romans and Greeks have criticized it, not with respect to just labeling all religious beliefs as superstition.
Well, then what do you believe that I would disagree with, assuming that I'm a fully
Well, I mean, I believe the
obnoxious
gods
Reddit
exist,
atheist?
so we probably disagree on that.
Well, there we
But
go.
I'm
Well, that's
holding that
you
the
just
gods
said,
exist.
but you just said you were against the superstition. Is that not like if
Right.
fairies
And
is
that's why I'm saying
superstition?
that I'm
Isn't
against the superstition with respect to how the Romans and the Greeks criticized it, not with respect to labeling all of religion as superstition. So when Plutarch, there's Roman and Greek writer Theophrastus and Plutarch. Theophrastus had a text called Characters, where he goes through a series of basically morally bad people and just describes like these negative characteristics. And one of them was the superstitious man. And the superstitious man describes somebody who is absolutely debilitated by trying to adhere to every single religious custom that is part of his society, such that it negatively impacted his life to the extent that he wasn't able to live. And describes this as like a moral flaw, basically. So when you have somebody that is believing in religion in such a way that they're taking it to this sort of like extremity and uh, impacting their own life in a negative way like that, that's where you can
obviously
criticize
my threshold
superstition.
is well beyond that point.
Sure.
I mean, I don't
And
even
so,
like horoscopes. I mean, I consider people who believe
right.
in horoscopes to fit in
And
this category.
horoscopes can manifest in that way, where you have somebody who is, because of their horoscopes, afraid to live,
No,
right?
any
Like that,
belief in
we see that
horoscopes,
manifestation.
like any at all, like any belief in it whatsoever.
I've got a not the best opinion on horoscopes generally, if you want my like absolute honest opinion.
They
But
predict
at the same
fascist
time,
beliefs.
if somebody, yeah, you're talking about the essentialism thing. I
Yeah.
think I addressed that in my video to you a year ago or some shit. But like, and I think that there is like an essentialism problem that shows up with horoscopes. True. I think that if you get into some forms of astrology, I see this is one of those things. This is a practice I'm not super familiar with, so it's not something that I would stake my arguments on. So, but you can have like fascistic expressions of it, definitely. Like that's, and I think that that's true of heathenry, my religion as well. There's definitely fascistic representations of heathenry where you get into heathens that engage in a supremacy narrative, and that supremacy narrative winds up being a racist one.
But I don't want any
And
of it. I don't,
right,
even
so
for the
you're not.
non.
I'm against the supremacy narratives.
Yeah, I
They
don't
don't
want
have to
any
be
of it.
against the religion in order to be against the supremacy
But the
narrative.
religion's still a problem because it adds non-empirical factors into what would otherwise potentially be an empirical ethical analysis. I mean,
And so do a lot of like, if you're engaging in mathematics, if you're engaging in logic, you're going to have to start engaging in some non-empirical stuff. Empiricism is not an end-all be-all when it comes to finding truth.
well, when it
And
comes to
there's several studies across philosophy that do not deal with empiricism. And I would like, among them would be history
but
deals with empiricism on some level, but you still have to make a certain amount of assumptions, such as the documents that you're reading are somewhat
I'm
reliable
not
as accounts and that kind of shit.
I'm not anti-philosophy, and I'm certainly not anti-analysis. I know that there are things that we do to obtain knowledge that go outside the bound of pure empirical measurement. The
Right.
problem
One of
is
those
that
things is theology.
religious people make empirical arguments or believe empirically in things that aren't empirical. So the belief in the existence of a god isn't a philosophical framework. It's not an analytical narrative.
You're saying they believe it empirically?
If a person believes that something is capable of affecting the real world, analysis isn't. Analysis can't change the interaction of photons and molecules or whatever. Philosophy can't. It informs the way we make empirical decisions. But if you believe there's a deity that can influence the physical world, you're making an empirical claim, not supported empirically. If the god is just this like abstract philosophical concept, like a sort of
Mhm.
like an analytical, no, like a alliterative way of describing a process, I would still take issue with it. Because this often takes the form of like the personification of natural phenomena, which impedes our understanding of it in a genuine empirical sense.
And
I
my
just
perspective on polytheism would be like definitely into the realm of what you would be against then, because I'm holding as the gods as external agents minds. We might talk about imminent polytheism or something like that and get into the kind of the various forms of
then
it.
you think
But
they're empirical. You're
again,
making an empirical claim there. Because if they affect
as
the real world, they have to
not
be
as I've held that
empirical.
the mind is non-physical. So, and I might be, I've been leaning towards like idealism lately as with respect to like my philosophy of what the external world is. So,
But can
um,
they, but like these gods, I mean, if they can direct the winds or control energy or matter or anything
mhm.
like that, they must necessarily be empirical phenomena. They're in the realm
Yeah,
of
you could
empirics.
probably say some empirical things about the areas that they manifest. Like you could probably predict where the rain is going and say that that's Freyr or something like that. But I don't think that that gives you necessarily access to Freyr's mind or anything. Just as knowing the parts of the brain doesn't necessarily give the ability to read a mind.
Yeah, but
And
if you,
maybe we'll develop that technology at some point, and it'd be interesting to see how that affects God belief or how we can interact with, like, if you have the ability, some sort of apparatus that is able to read a mind and utilize that in order to have some sort of communication with the gods, and that starts getting revealed, then you start having empirical conversations about minds and gods and all of that kind of shit, and you wind up answering a few questions with respect to mind body problem and all this other philosophical crap that we've been hitting our heads with
this is
for
what led
millennia.
to
But that's not where we're at right now.
this is
You
what
know what I
led to
mean?
people doing rain dances. I mean, it's a
I have
non.
no problem with rain dances.
Well, I know, but I do because they cause people to starve because they thought they could solve their famines by dancing instead of other approaches towards towards agricultural management. It doesn't do anything.
Right. I don't think that it matters necessarily, like, as far as this conversation goes, what as far as the arguments whether or not God exists. I think that where I can hang my hat on and where you can hang your hat on is that when you get into the upper echelons of the philosophical conversation, this isn't a settled matter. And I think that I've even heard you say that we should be withholding judgment at the end of the day, right?
I'll withhold judgment when talking to people, but if I'm talking about why I reject these ideas, I mean, I have to be forthcoming about it. I think it brings ruin. And it's an unreliable way of assessing a person's ethics, No matter how you came to believe in what you believe in, the gods or whatever, you got that from somewhere. And
Mhm.
if you got that from somewhere, that means there's a source from which you can derive non-empirical beliefs. And all it would
Right.
take is a
I mean, you
corruption
believe
of
that
that
it,
source of information for you to potentially believe in the valid, like the nature, like human sacrifice. People did
yeah.
that for their polytheistic deities. And how could I
Mhm.
morally argue you out of that? If you genuinely believe that a famine could be settled with a human sacrifice, if that's an empirical belief that you hold, ethically, you're in the right. The problem is that your predicating beliefs are incorrect. The existence of that God, the value of the human sacrifice. But I could never argue you out of that.
So arguments against human sacrifice show up with Plutarch, and I think that again we can talk about pluralism with respect to human sacrifice. Harmful practices are going to be the kind of thing which, as a pluralist, you're going to be objecting to.
Why? If the
Pluralism, I think,
gods
is
will
going to be a
reward
better
us,
strategy here.
but if the gods
What's
will
up?
reward us with bounty and food, if we perform a human
I'd argue even
sacrifice,
then, it's if even if you try to argue that kind of thing, I don't think that you could demonstrate that. First off, and second, I don't think that even if it's true, it's something that is worth engaging in because of the harmful practice
well,
nature of it.
we're not basing our beliefs on whether we can demonstrate it. That's the whole point. You don't either.
Right.
That's
So
my
if you're going to
game.
say that it's a good practice to do, you need to be able to demonstrate on some level that it's a good practice to do. And that's not, if you're going to,
You said you're
especially
okay
with
with rain
respect to harming
dances.
somebody. So what?
You said you're okay with rain dances.
Yeah. There's not a harmful element to that.
Well, there's a very beneficial element to potentially ending a drought or a famine, right? I mean, if they
Right.
believe that,
Like if somebody is, I'd say that if you're, if somebody is engaging in rain dances and or prayers for rain or something like that, that's not necessarily a problem because it's not a harmful practice.
right, but the
When you're
problem
talking about human sacrifice, all of a sudden you're dealing with harmful
if
practices, right?
if people believe enough in the idea that showing glory to a deity will bring good to
Mhm.
do a rain dance, human sacrifices aren't that far off. You take
we object to that to the same way we object to political beliefs that have the same kind of consequences.
But
genocide group X, therefore, and that'll be better for our society.
But I don't have to argue against
like
a religion. I can do empirics in there.
Right, you're going to be arguing against something that can't be demonstrated until, you know what I mean? Like this.
No, but if that's the point. Religious people don't wait to see if it's demonstrated. Christians
neither
pray.
do the political narratives.
Yeah, but
if you have the political narrative that is like, hey, let's do genocide X, then you're not going to have people that are going to go, oh, well, can you demonstrate that first or whatever the fuck? Like that's we've seen that a couple of times in history, right?
Well, first of all, most genocides have been committed by religious people, so we're kind of shaking, like we're arguing on shaky ground, like from the get-go there. And second, of like overwhelmingly
mass
throughout
murders
history
of populations.
I'm not arguing that secular people are always rational. I'm only saying that adding the religiosity adds an additional extra layer of like immutable political like invulnerability when it comes to argumentation. If a group of people, like a community or a culture or whatever, believe there are gods in the sky that do reward them with rain or with food or with bounty when they show those gods glory, the step up to human sacrifice is a totally rational one. This is why I hate that like Westerners arrogantly look down on human sacrifice in like Aztec culture or whatever. Like that's so much more barbaric than the fucking Crusades, which had like 5,000, 10,000, 500,000 times.
I'm not going to be defending the Crusades either. Crusades are obviously a harmful practice and anti-pluralist, right? So like, I mean, as a pagan, I'm not going to have a good position on the Crusades. I think that even Christianity in general, you might be able to make some pluralist arguments against. However, because I think that with Christianity, we find a proclivity towards authoritarianism. And that proclivity towards authoritarianism is what lends to shit where you get into the justification of harmful practices, regardless of the effect. Well, because now you have a supremacy narrative. Now you have authoritarianism.
But I'm not saying that you're would be pro-Crusades. I'm only arguing that from the perspective of the Aztecs, the idea of human sacrifice was an empirically justifiable one. They already believed that showing glory to the gods would bring them bounty. So a human sacrifice...
Wait, what do you think empirical is?
Because they thought the gods were an empirical force in the world. If you presuppose that the gods exist empirically, as in they can affect the world.
What is empirical?
Sorry, maybe material. Maybe I'm misusing the word. Like a material. Okay. They believe the gods are a material force in the world. And if you presuppose that,
I don't. As polytheists, we generally hold that the non-physicalness is an aspect.
I'm pretty sure
as part of the
Aztecs did believe that the gods
Aztecs were not physicalists, and regardless, as far as the Aztecs being. We can take it to another. Let's move from the Aztecs to
no, but I haven't finished the
Hold
point
on,
yet.
1 second.
Wait,
1 second.
But you can't 1 second me. I have to 1 second you.
You can still talk about human sacrifice. I just want to move it to a religion I'm more familiar with. We can talk about the history of my own religion, which has human sacrifice in it, and we can discuss it from there. It's just I want to move it out of like out of that conversation into one that I have a little bit more familiarity with, but still has the same problem, so that we can discuss it substantively.
Okay.
All right, go ahead. So heathens in the past did human sacrifices to Odin. Yes, we agree on that. So go ahead and make your point.
Okay. If they believe that the gods are a material force in the world, which they did, even if they didn't believe the gods would show up and fuck them physically, but they did believe that. I know, it was Odin and Thor. They fucked
You had some euhemerist beliefs with history, yeah. They've got Snorri talking about how Freyr is part of the royal family of Sweden or whatever.
Literally thought, like, in the world.
It's a Christian's record, but anyway, whatever. Go ahead.
They thought even if they were just metaphysical forces, Thor being lightning would mean that he could affect the world materially. And if you believe those things, if that's a material belief that you hold, unerringly, people would be executed for heresy. I mean, you have to believe this to varying extents. It is not irrational. It is purely logical to then go, yeah, human sacrifices to honor the gods are a good thing. That's a correct argument if you presuppose the existence of those gods. And that's what makes the religious angle
You can have
really
the existence of the gods, and you can even hold that human sacrifice is effective or whatever. Not my position, but let's talk about it. You can still at that point hold a pluralist position and say, regardless of whatever effect human sacrifice has, regardless of it, it's still not a preferable position or preferable practice to have because of the harm associated with it. Doesn't matter.
It absolutely
if the gods are asking
matters.
you to do things that are unethical, then fuck that shit.
Right?
Like that's easy enough to convince somebody to do. If the gods are asking you to harm people that are your friends, There's no reason to actually listen to
But
that
they
shit.
thought the gods would raise their villages. The Norse, the pagans didn't believe that the gods were necessarily the arbiters of morality, but they did believe they'd be punished for not showing due deference to the gods. So if it's like, if you can
And
do a
that's
human
not something.
sacrifice to
Okay,
keep
so
your
this gets
village from getting
into
raised,
this gets into a misunderstanding of history with respect to pagan belief, where it's like, well, they worship the gods because they were afraid of them on some level. This is not what we see bearing out in history when we read these people actually discussing their own religions. Usually what's going on is that we see people that are giving and sacrifice and engaging in a system of reciprocity, gifts for a gift, that the gods give gifts and they give gifts in return. It's not like, oh, well, we didn't sacrifice to the gods, therefore we're going to be experiencing a tsunami tomorrow or some shit, or that human sacrifices were not participated in or whatever. Like, this is getting into like highly superstitious beliefs, which we have records of people in history bitching about and saying, this is a terrible practice. Stop fucking doing it because of the consequences of it.
There would be consequences for not venerating the gods and benefits to venerating the gods. That's pretty common across like all.
And the consequence to human sacrifice is dead humans.
Dead humans happen all the time. You lose humans sending them out on hunting expeditions, but you execute one for the sake of keeping the god from raising your village or ending a drought. That's an ethical like argument that lands in your favor. Ethically, like if you send a group of people out in a hunting party or a raiding party, we're talking about Vikings here after all, you're far more likely to get more death for less gain than maintaining a studious and reverent relationship with your deities. So human sacrifice is a logical thing to do under
But we
those
see also in history that if the gods do not receive sacrifice, that the substantive damages that happen is not necessarily that kind of severe.
If they
people have been Christian for a long time, and especially now, right? Like if we're gonna be talking about religiosity now, with the arguments that we have access to, and not just what people think are possible religions that exist. You know what I mean? Because I think that what you're talking about is like, well, if we have a possibility of this religion in which we can possibly come to that conclusion, all that kind of stuff. This is where we get into the religion analogy or the politics analogy really quickly, that you can have people that are organized by atheistically, fascistically, and the problem there is going to be the authoritarianism. The problem with what you're talking about is the authoritarian aspect. Not necessarily just mere God belief
it's the
at that point.
Process. It's the belief in anything spiritual that does this. It's not the authoritarian aspect. If you believe that there's a God, wait, please. If you believe there's a literal God that dictates the rains and that it's represented by a capricious woman, and that glory to that woman in the form of sacrifice will bring the rains and end the drought, that all of the predicating beliefs, all of the material assumptions about the nature of rain and that God, now you have a logical argument for human sacrifice. That's not about authoritarianism.
You can come up with a logical argument for inhumane shit all the fucking time. The thing that I'm saying, and the point, one second, the point of this discussion of which I'm trying to do is not necessarily argue that in any religious construction, you're going to be able to get entirely, moral people or moral beliefs in any subset. I don't think that that's something you can say about any set of beliefs. You have, when you get into an extremism or fundamentalism representation of any religion, you wind up with these serious problems. And that goes true for any ideology in general, beyond the spiritual shit.
Stop. No. Wait, I can't let you get away with that.
You get extremist? What do you mean?
You can't equivocate this to extremist political systems. My arguments aren't against extreme religion. I'm arguing against the very concept of making statements about the material world based on metaphysical presumptions. It has nothing to do with how extreme.
But we've already agreed that metaphysical presumptions can be made with effect, right? Like that, in order to study history, in order to study logic, in order to even to get anywhere in theology, in order to get anywhere with logic in the first place, you're going to need to make some metaphysical assumptions. In order to engage with the external world, you need to make metaphysical assumptions.
Outside of the basic ones for engaging with the world, that's not the same as also believing in deities that control the rain. There are basic,
if you want to explore spiritually, there's certain assumptions you're going to make. Just like if you want to explore history, there's going to be certain assumptions you're going to make.
Metaphysical assumptions are equal.
Mathematics,
you do not have to make any metaphysical assumptions to understand history at all. You don't have to. You can keep that entirely within the material world. The metaphysics in our case are just bridging consciousness gaps. But you don't need to then go, okay, because we have to bridge the consciousness gap, therefore it's okay to believe in fucking Odin. Like you can't jump that and then run to any metaphysical argument.
You have different arguments with respect to deities, right? Like, so with polytheism, arguments are going to be related to personal experience, the diversity of personal experiences, and then at that point, you're going to be getting into some form of polytheism.
Well, people can
That's
be
the
wrong for
general
lots of
steps that you're going to
reasons.
be able to get there. And people are going to continue to have spiritual experiences. People are going to continue to explore spirituality on the basis of those assumptions. It's something that you agreed earlier in this conversation we're just going to have to deal with.
Yes,
So
people are
from that
often wrong. That
perspective,
doesn't
how
mean
do
I
you
can't.
deal with that socially? And that's where I'm saying pluralism is preferable to anti-theism.
Well, no,
because
because
anti-theism,
people
in
are
my
going to have
opinion, is just another
experiences.
supremacy narrative at the end of the day.
People are going to have
Pluralism is not.
experiences that make them racist or sexist because we have tribal instincts like buried deep in our lizard brains that cause
Right.
us
I'm
to
not
make
saying
group
trust
assumptions.
every experience, right?
Oh, okay, so even
Right.
though humans are going to keep having tribalistic biases ingrained into their brains, I think you should still principally fight against that type of
What the
behavior.
problem is and articulate what the actual issue is at the end of the day. And that's where I'm saying all the examples that you're bringing up are extremist fundamentalist expressions of religion.
No, they're not. I talked about horoscopes. That's not an extremist fundamentalist aspect of religion.
And horoscopes, we can probably agree, can be practiced without anybody dying in the process.
I don't care if
I think
people
that
die. I don't
you make
like
a
them.
point with respect to horoscopes where it talks about essentializing people. And on that, I agree with you on. And I think I've said as much in the past. But I don't think that when you're looking at practices in general, you should be looking at them under the auspices of what harm they cause, and then making a judgment call on that effect. Because
Yes, what
people,
harm
again,
does
are
the
going to be
system
religious.
cause? I mean,
People are going to continue exploring
if
religiosity.
we want to talk about the harm religion is causing right now, then you're going to have to wait for fundamentalist Christians to die off. Because if we're talking about immediate empirical harm,
we need to be able to criticize fundamentalist Christians without attacking our allies, right?
wait, you can
And
wait.
that's
There
why
are
I'm saying
allies who
pluralism
have,
is the way to go.
there are allies who have toxic masculine tendencies. You can still target toxic masculinity while being like you're jumping between like spiritual critiques and ethical positions and like the pragmatics
Because
of coalition building.
The spiritual critiques that you're making and the spiritual critiques that I think that are a good system to go under are both ethical considerations, right? Unless you think that human sacrifice is bad for some reason other than ethical reasons.
I think that it's bad for ethical reasons unless you
Right.
believe that there's a God who will end a drought, in which case I think it's ethically good to do because you've now established supernatural.
That's just a bad argument.
It's not.
At
Wait,
that point, no. If you're going
Wait,
to
how is
say
that
that human
bad?
sacrifice is ethical under certain considerations,
Wait, wait. Especially
Why?
back in those days, we sacrificed people all the time to go on hunting trips, to go on expeditions, to go gather resources. All the
Right.
time they lost people. If you could end a drought that's plaguing a country of millions with a human sacrifice, that is an incredibly straightforward ethical assumption for that time period.
And in this time period, that is an extremist notion. Right?
There are places in the world right now that are suffering from drought. What if you could like in West Africa end malaria with a human sacrifice?
Can it be done?
Well, I'm not religious, so no.
Right.
But if a person believed that it could be done, would it be ethical?
That's not an expression of religion that I would be holding to. I think that if you're going to be engaging in harmful practices, it should not be done.
But if
harmful practice is bad,
if you
right,
believe
and we can
it
make
could be
criticisms
done,
of religions on the basis of their harmful practices,
you would be saving hundreds of thousands of lives. If you believed it could be done, would you agree it's an ethically right thing to do? Like, hey, does anyone volunteer in the entirety of West Africa? One person is willing to lay themselves down on the table? Like
I'm not interested in getting convinced into some sort of human sacrifice notion.
Wait, wouldn't
it's not
you
something that I would hold?
If you believed that malaria, the biggest killer of humans, next to like cancer or whatever, could be ended with one sacrifice.
As my chat's kind of pointing this out, this is consequentialist thinking.
I am a consequentialist.
If that would be a big difference between us then, because I think
that's another problem.
The action that is ethically wrong is not going to be the best approach in order to actually deal with a problem like this.
But it wouldn't be an action that's ethically wrong. The consequences of it would be good. Therefore, it would be an ethically good action.
This is the problem with consequentialism, not a problem with religious thinking.
No, this is very basic religious thinking right here.
This is your position, not mine at this point. That you're saying that if you held religiosity and were a consequentialist, this would be the result, right?
If you believe
this is a problem with consequentialism,
that malaria could be ended with that, you would then say, no, malaria should continue. Hundreds of thousands should die every year. Not one person should be allowed to volunteer for sacrifice.
If you have that situation as a reality, then you're going to find like a couple of consequentialists that are probably going to be engaging with that on a consensual basis between each other. And then the problem does whatever it does. But that does not mean that I'm necessarily going to be condoning it, because I'm not a fucking consequentialist at the end of the day. I believe that if you're going to be having practices that are harmful, then you need to be criticizing those practices on the basis of harm.
But not addressing malaria would be harmful.
They can be. Sorry, I misspoke. These practices can be criticized on the basis of their harm, right?
Like allowing malaria to continue, which would be the consequence of not allowing somebody to be sacrificed.
Is the religious practice is not doing something a practice?
I'm sorry?
Is not doing something a practice?
Wait, absolutely. You're absolutely responsible for what happens if you choose not to do something. Yes. Okay.
Then sure. And that can be like a large ethical conversation. But I think that at that point, you're going to want to talk about how effective those practices are going to be.
Well, hundreds of thousands of people.
At that point, if this situation arises, what is going to be your position? Do you hold that we should do the human sacrifice at that point?
To save hundreds of, yeah, absolutely. That's the best.
And then that would be your position. Ratio. I'm not necessarily of that position because of the harmful practice aspect. Because then we're opening the door to doing human sacrifice for all kinds of stuff. We're building a cultural narrative and to getting into human sacrifice as a regular practice generally.
We do this with military.
That's something that is going to be creating a superstitious angle, and I'm not into that.
We sacrifice our soldiers so that they can affect good geopolitical outcomes. World War II, we made the decision tens of thousands of our soldiers can die because it's better.
That's a little bit different of a fight is a different practice than killing them yourself.
Blood is the only relevant human currency when it comes to great actions that are recorded in history books, I'm afraid. No matter what you choose, yes, no, abstemiousness or not, people are going to get hurt.
But you're going to also agree that some of those actions are unethical. You can make an unethical action and have beneficial consequences from it. This is ends justify the means, and we see that throughout history too. It doesn't mean it's something we ought do.
Well, that's consequentialism, if the ends do justify the means.
And that's where a big difference between us. Let me try and make this argument in a way to appeal to the consequentialism, though. So if you're wanting to engage in a way that is going to create change, you're going to want to get as many people on your side as possible.
No, I don't want to get to the coalition building part.
You're going to be wanting to engage in a pluralist standard rather than an anti-theist standard.
I believe in reaching out to guys who have toxic masculine aspects, but I'll still sit on here and argue that toxic masculinity is bad for 7 hours straight. This isn't
sure.
I'm not pitching this to a crowd right now. I'm just talking about my basic beliefs about what types of thoughts are good, what's structured well. I'm not making the case for the pan-religious socialist union of America or whatever. If I was, then I wouldn't talk about any of this because I don't think I can convince anyone or affect any positive change while pitching it there behind the podium. But here, while talking about the basics.
If you're going to hold a position that is anti-theist, and then when you're expressing it on your channel, you're engaging in political action.
I talk about toxic masculinity on my channel, but I still want guys to have those tendencies.
And that's good. So do I. I've got a video on toxic masculinity as well. So we're on the same page with respect to that.
Well, so we agree.
I think that we would agree that toxic masculinity is in all cases bad, right?
Well, if it's toxic masculinity, by definition, it has to be bad because it's toxic.
So we can also talk about toxic religiosity, right?
Well, I would just think religiosity is toxic religiosity.
Right. And so
I don't think there's a good one.
I think that with masculinity, you can have beneficial expressions of masculinity and you can have beneficial expressions of religiosity. We can separate those issues by saying we're not demonizing masculinity. We're talking about toxic masculinity, and we're not demonizing religiosity. We're talking about toxic religiosity.
I am demonizing
and that's the criticisms that were being made by Plutarch and Theophrastus in the past. They were talking about toxic expressions of religiosity.
But I am talking about all religiosity. It's not about the outcomes. It's the thought process for me.
And so there's no beneficial religiosity to you.
Everything that can be done from religiosity that is good can be done through secular means. And even if that wasn't the case, I would still be against religiosity. It is so far down. I hold it in such a low regard.
Okay. This is...
You can get what you want.
This is where we get into toxic narratives of atheism, in my opinion. Where if you have toxic veganism, if you have toxic leftism, you get fucking tankies that have narratives in which they're better than everybody else. If you have toxic Christianity, that's when you get into authoritarian fundamentalism, where if they think they're better than everybody else. If you have toxic pagans, you get folkists who are racist shitheads who think they're better than everybody else. And then you have toxic atheists who are anti-theists who engage in a supremacy narrative in which they think they're better than everybody else and want the world to be secular.
Wait, please stop.
Okay.
Again, it's not about being better than religious people. There are plenty of religious people who are in almost every imaginable sense more accomplished and more impressive than I am. It is about religion, the openness to spiritualism, being a fundamentally destructive thought process that erodes the ability to make...
The same argument applies to politics, man.
No, because
if you're open to political narratives, then you're open to
empirics.
toxic political narratives.
It's not about whether or not it's you keep... Okay, again, it's
It's
not
just,
about...
this is
wait,
the,
no,
please.
The
toxic masculinity thing is such a better example because
it's not about toxic religion versus non-toxic. I am attacking all of it. So
it's unjustifiably, I think.
So okay, you may think that, but you keep relating this to like, well, politics can have bad outcomes. I know everything can have bad outcomes
because the criticism you're applying applies there.
No, it isn't, because I think religiosity fundamentally erodes the capacity to make logical arguments, because you're capable of adding supernatural justifications for ethical arguments on a fundamental
whole study
level.
A philosophy of religion that it requires logical arguments of people going back and forth over this issue. If what you were saying was true,
have supernatural beliefs.
Hold on. If what you're saying was true, in philosophy of religion, you would have the atheists being like, these theists are absolutely crazy. They're not using logical arguments at all, right?
No, I didn't say religious people can't use logic. There are plenty of logical religious people.
Right, but you said fundamentally, which means that.
It's like, imagine...
so it's fundamentally an issue,
so it's
which
additive.
means that it's not, there's not exceptions.
No, yes, that is correct. Religion is fundamentally an erosive force when it comes to rational thought. But there are still rational people in spite of their religion, much in the same way that there are people who are overwhelmingly good, but you might say that it's like fundamentally bad to undertip waiters. So you can have people who are like 99.9% good, but they always undertip the waiters, and that's shitty of them to do, and that should be criticized, but it's still possible to be like a generally really great person in spite of that.
Yeah, this is just a claim that you're not able to demonstrate, in my opinion.
But I've been talking about how it erodes
positive manifestations of religion.
Okay, fine. If I am a rational, non-religious person, as long as you and I have the same basic axioms of well-being, it should always be possible to change my mind on something. If you give counterexamples on empirics, you should always be able to adjust my position. There's always going to be some variety there, because so much of what people understand about the world is colored by personal
you'd have
experience.
Irrational atheists and all that kind of stuff. I think that we've already agreed on that.
Yeah, but theoretically, if you took a rational person and they were a secular, it should be possible. But if there was a religious person who had supernatural justifications for some of their positions, beliefs about the world that aren't tied directly to empirical analysis, even if you had the same basic axioms, if they had a disagreement with you based on some of those presuppositions, it would not be possible to change their mind, because it's rooted in something outside the bounds of physical logic. You would have to...
This is where... All right, so again...
This is where
I was talking about ethical constraints on religion that we've seen manifest in history a few times, going back to Plutarch and Theophrastus, where Plutarch is criticizing the superstitiousness of human sacrifice and as a harmful practice and the effects of that. And then Theophrastus is talking about superstition as it relates to the harm to your personal life.
Out of curiosity, could you convince such a person that they were wrong in what they were doing?
If you can demonstrate it to them, I think that it can be difficult, but I think it's difficult to convince people that they're wrong on things that they're wrong about generally.
Ever tried convincing a religious person that they're following their religious doctrine too closely? That you think it's easy to convince them?
That's something that comes up. I've managed a community full of religious people. We have conversations around that all the time with respect to, okay, wait, there's mythic literalism is something that is criticized within my community. That's basically within Christianity that would manifest as creationism. I think that when you're taking religious documents to a absolute literal standpoint, you're going to get ridiculous results, like thinking that plants predate the sun, which can be empirically shown as not true.
Wait, why would a person who believes in a god care about empirics? Why would the faulty tools of man stand up to the word of God printed on the Bible?
Yeah, this is where you get into fundamentalism, which is something
What's wrong with fundamentalism? Okay, let's try this from a different perspective. I'm now Christian. Or no, I'm actually a pagan. Okay, and I hold a variety of beliefs, and I want you to explain to me how they're morally wrong. Okay? Okay. So I dedicate 80% of all my earnings to a tithe to the local church, because I believe that if I don't do so, I'll be struck down by lightning in my sleep.
You mean a tithe?
Tithe, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So like getting 80% of your earnings is something that is well beyond means. And like, there's not, unless you're making a shitload of money, you're not going to be able to live very well off of that.
So
And
I'll
that's what we're going
die.
to be talking about Theophrastus. Right. That's you are bringing harm to your own life in your religious practice. And that's something that is not going to be helpful or productive to you.
It does, and it's the gods. So I'll die.
Right. And there's a point of like, if somebody is just dead convinced that they're going to be engaging in self-harm, there's only so much logical reasoning that you can give to somebody to that, if they're religious
It's
or not.
God.
Like, if somebody is just like, if somebody's talking about self-harm from any number of perspectives, honestly, and they're dead convinced that they're going to be doing it, it's difficult to convince them out of it.
How can you convince a person that self-harm is wrong if that self-harm
But I gave you a logical argument about it, and you just said so, right? If whatever logical ethical argument that I give to anybody, if their response is so and their ethics just disagree with you, this is something that is well outside the bounds of a religious conversation.
Wait, no, it's not. It's God.
Yeah,
the point of gods is that they're above us. You know, personally, I think I'm being serious for a moment, incredibly funny when pagans come on my stream and they talk about gods, though they're buddy-buddy. They're above you. That's the point. If you die for them, that's fine. They are literally the mesh that holds the world together for you guys. The idea that you can apply some kind of like abstemious ethical argument where like, oh no, we would never do a human sacrifice. It's only the mesh of the universe.
I'm going to agree with you, but also disagree with you here. Because with the majority of polytheist traditions that I'm familiar with, yes, the gods are above us. This buddy thing, I would agree with you, winds up being like a different kind of toxic. And I think that winds up being like an overcorrection of former Christians. But
how is that
at the
toxic?
same time, say what?
How is that toxic? If you believe it, you believe it. We're not
the buddy thing.
The hierarchical, them being above us, self-harm for them thing. Like, how is that harmful at all? It's just as
because you talked about self-harm and then asked how it was harmful. It's harmful because it's self-harm.
No, that applies to my logic because I don't think there's anything above me. You believe in gods. If self-harm is being done for a god, what's wrong with that?
Because it's harmful.
It's gods.
You can have ethical constraints on practice. This is not unreasonable, and this is something we see in history from polytheists, which is what I've been bringing up over and over again.
I've seen lacks of those ethical constraints demonstrated by polytheists as well.
Absolutely. And just as you're going to find ethical lapses within any ideological system.
I agree with that.
Right. But so we should criticize the ethical lapses, not necessarily just the ideological system in the first place.
What if a person...
If I said that if I gave you every example of toxic leftists not being convinced of empirical arguments, right, and then therefore said leftism bad because of these multiple examples of leftists being shitty.
Again, it's not about whether the system can be bad. Every system can be bad. My problem is with the root.
We're agreeing now on that.
I can make a logical argument against a bad outcome in a leftist system. If a person believes that the universe is God and God determines what's right or wrong, there's literally no logical argument against that. It is logically bulletproof. It can't
that's
be
an authoritarian position, and that's what
then the universe is authoritarian.
You get into criticism of religion, and I think that you should be able to criticize religion. Often what's going to be happening is that you're going to be finding fundamentalism, extremism, or authoritarianism. And if you want to criticize religion and be against the toxic aspects of it, you can criticize them on those bases. And I'd add to that supremacy narratives, which I think show up and these things will show up in multiple ideologies, and that's what makes them into toxic narratives.
What's toxic about the supremacy narrative if you believe that the god is above you? They're literally above you. So the supremacy narrative would be the correct one. It'd be logically correct, right?
This would be, do you think that the universe is bigger than you or something like that? I don't necessarily think that winds up being a supremacy narrative in that way. Clearly, supremacy narrative, what I'm talking about is when you have populations of people viewing themselves as better than others.
What if the gods say that
you can find this in religion as a prime example with Christianity, where they believe that the fact that they believe in their God ultimately makes them better than others because they think that everybody else is going to be going and burning for all of eternity.
What's logically incorrect about that?
Right?
What's logically incorrect about that?
What's logically incorrect
about that? What's the problem? If they're God's chosen people and they believe that all the heretics are going to burn, what's the issue?
If you want to talk about like an internal critique or an external critique or what?
How could you convince them
because you can have internal problems with it, and that they claim that their God is merciful, and then also is like sending a bunch of people to burn that he created, and then you get into questions of like whether or not he knows the future, and who actually bears responsibility if he's the creator, especially if you're like a Calvinist or something like that, and you hold a deterministic view that God creates all of his creations, is omnibenevolent, and then also creates his creations in order to that generate sin, that winds up being self-contradictory and illogical, because you
God
have
is above logic.
God is the ultimate responsible element there, and is therefore responsible for all of the actions that people below him
God is
contribute
above
to, because
logic.
he's the one who created all of it.
It doesn't
right?
matter. God is above logic.
Then God is illogical. Now you're just saying, now you wanted to say
No,
that
your
whether or
logic,
not God
your
is logical
logic is a
there,
human
you
tool.
just said God is illogical at that point.
Well, from our perspective, yeah, God works in mysterious ways. It's like Christianity 101, right? It doesn't matter whether or not God is logical. You can't mount a logical argument
All right,
against
well, you
God.
asked what was logically wrong with it, and then you said that God is it beyond logic or whatever.
Exactly. So your
now
arguments
he's
are defeated.
outside of logic, and that would be the criticism of the religion at that point, that is not a logical position.
Well, yeah, oh, sure, great. Then he's outside of logic. So what's the issue?
Right.
They say as they're stabbing you to death.
That's the problem with it then, is that it's illogical.
What's the issue with that?
What do you mean, what's the issue with that? Are you saying that you can't criticize religion and saying it's illogical?
Well, hold on. Christians have been criticized for the holes in their story for quite a long time, and yet the institution persists. What is the issue?
And I don't have a problem with criticizing religion. I think that criticizing religion is a good thing, and I think that calling their deity illogical when it manifests in logical inconsistencies is good.
It's the universe.
We should continue doing that.
Wait, it doesn't matter if the Christian God is illogical. The Christian God is the Christian God. Logic is a human tool. Your mind literally cannot comprehend the logistics of what God does.
I think a lot of Christians have trouble biting a bullet and saying that their God is illogical.
Is it wrong?
Every time I've gotten a Christian to go into that route, they start trying to backtrack real fast. So it's the question. If you're a consequentialist, you're going to be wondering whether or not these arguments are effective. That one is effective.
If I'm a consequentialist, I'm going to be beating these people to death with a hammer, because there is literally no fucking way to make a logical argument to a person whose ethics are rooted in religion. It's not possible. I've tried. You can't do it. You just hope that their ethical positions...
You've just tried with toxic people.
No, it's not about toxicity. I can try to convince people who are wrong based on secular grounds. That's my whole channel. I can't convince people who are wrong on something ethically because they religiously believe in some extra thing, some dark matter solution that fixes their positions.
So I think this might just be a problem with the way that you're handling the argument at that point, because I've been able to do this. And so then we'd want to be able to figure out, all right, what arguments are you using there, and why aren't they being effective?
It doesn't matter
if you're just like haranguing against religious belief, it's not actually going to be effective as far as changing somebody's mind with respect to their deity.
Whether or not you're effective, the problem is there isn't a right answer. There's no reliable way of doing it.
Hold on. If you're a consequentialist and you're saying it doesn't matter whether or not it's effective, what the fuck are you going?
How do you disprove a metaphysically rooted material belief?
Well, we just went through saying it's illogical, right?
That doesn't matter. It's metaphysics. It's a whole level above.
Metaphysics is constrained by logic.
No,
ask anybody that's engaging in metaphysics. This is going to be constrained by logic.
Not if the metaphysical position is they work in mysterious ways. That is a valid metaphysical position. It is one tier above our logic.
Okay, so we're probably going to agree that God works in mysterious ways is a boring cop-out as far as the conversation goes.
We're not
and that's
judging
when somebody is saying
here.
that they've lost the conversation.
People die over this.
Yeah. That's a problem, right?
It's not a problem for them. You don't understand. The groundwork here is a non-productive
space, and I want to see if we can find a productive space.
The groundwork here is not workable. If there is a material belief that is rooted in a metaphysical presupposition that can't be logically argued against, then there's no way to move them off that belief outside of hitting them on the head and hoping their brain reshuffles.
Logic is a really good tool against somebody who's holding a logically ridiculous position, if you can get them to understand the fallaciousness.
Can you explain logically why you believe in the gods? Just really quick. Can you run by me?
I went through that argument a minute ago with respect to experience.
What? So you realize that your brain is like a faulty meat computer that can interpret anything.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's something with absolute confidence. I think that getting into a discussion about whether or not the gods exist is going to be something that is going to require a whole nother conversation. I
They
think,
don't.
especially
It
with the
doesn't
amount of
require a
resistance that you're
convo.
putting
They
up to
don't.
it.
They don't.
Let's just be fair.
It doesn't require convo. They don't. There's no evidence for it. We can only make
Sure, there
statements
is. You
about what we have.
experiential evidence is something
What
that you can engage
experiential
with
evidence?
theologically. Say what?
What experiential evidence is there for the existence of the gods?
We have multiplicity of spiritual experiences in humans
That's
across
not.
the
This
world.
isn't. That's not an answer. Humans have had multiplicities of lots of things. That's not. Our brains are faulty. We interpret our
You
dying moments as spiritual
and
experiences.
what you're giving is a logical argument that one can be an atheist, and I agree with you. One can be an atheist
No,
logically,
that's
and
the
that's
only
fine.
logical argument that you can have, or at least an agnostic.
No,
Yes.
and this
Yes.
is where, right. So then what I'm going to do is, instead of like getting into an argument with you on this, is defer to the existing philosophical debates on PhD level in the highest
I don't care.
echelons of
They're
this
all gay.
conversation,
People have
where
been
they're
talking
going
about
back and forth with
dragons
each
for
other,
centuries.
and that the atheist philosophers are not saying what you're saying to their opponents.
That's fine. They're all cuckolds. People have
Oh
been
my
talking
God.
about dragons for hundreds of years. Does that mean dragons are real? People have shared. We have a cultural imagination that informs
Historically,
the
we're pretty
experiences.
confident that dragons do not exist, but as far as philosophy is concerned, the
Our
confidence
gods keep
level is
changing.
significantly lower with respect to gods.
I think about as many people right now believe in dragons as they do Odin and stuff. Those numbers are probably not too far off. What with
I
it
would
being,
doubt that.
how can you possibly argue the validity of one particular religious system when the world moved on from it, and the evidence is, oh yeah, well, I know our brains can weakly interpret like liminal experiences as supernatural depending on their cultural influences.
Right. If you want to talk about potentiality, right, and you want to hold that potentiality is a valid cause for holding a position, then you're going to get into potentiality regarding the gods. And then now it's valid to hold that position because our brains are we're potentially engaging in hallucinations with respect to spiritual experiences. We're also potentially dealing with reality when we have spiritual experiences. Both are true, right? It's as far as the potentiality is concerned.
Dreams.
This is why there's
thinking
agnosticism when it comes to what the settled matter on this is. It's not that when you get into the philosophical tradition of debate around this issue on the highest levels, it's not a settled science.
There is no, it's not a settled science because there's never been a start to the science. It's not a settled anything. You have
Settled
to make
philosophy
a claim.
then. Science is the wrong term. You're correct. But philosophy would be science would be a subset of philosophy.
I agree with that. But
right.
It's definitely not a science. There's no empirical evidence for any of it.
I agreed. I've already given you that. It's not like theology is not a science in the same way. That any philosophical system that doesn't fall under science is not a science, right? I hesitate to say which way history goes, but it's where you get into questions of soft sciences, whether or not they're sciences or whatever the fuck.
I think generally speaking, it's best when we adjust our beliefs in accordance with the evidence, because if we make wild leaps and start basing ethical arguments and material understandings on highly speculative, like very circumstantial or possibly non-existent evidence, you like run into massive problems when it comes to like social cohesion, ethical reasoning, stuff like that. I think it's important that we
have a lot of agreement.
We scale it back. Now, this isn't an argument against philosophy or like analytical engagement. I mean, everyone can have different opinions on the world around them. That's fine. But I think there's a big difference between like varying philosophical perspectives and saying that like we live in a world with spirits or with gods or there is an afterlife, because now you're talking about things that affect what people might make logical arguments off of. And if a person believes in the afterlife, how can I tell them that murdering people is wrong if they think it'll send them to a better place?
I would love it if everybody tempered their beliefs with respect to available evidence on the matter. And that would be something that, like, I believe that I'm doing that with respect to my religious exploration. I hold that I don't know that the gods exist, but I'm exploring with respect to my experiences. And my belief in the gods is provisional on the basis of that respect. Right. And I think that if more people did that, we'd have a healthier engagement with respect to religion. And I think that if you want to talk, again, toxic spirituality is when you don't do that.
You can't tell a person, hey, only have faith when the evidence demands it. That's not how faith works.
I think that you can temper your position with respect to available evidence.
That's not
reasonable.
what faith is.
again, I'm pagan, not Christian. We're looking at faith completely differently, I think. So
when you say
it's
that
a
you have
narrative
faith in
around faith.
something, when you say you have faith in something, you're saying that in spite of a lack of evidence, you still believe that thing exists.
No, I think it's a bad definition of faith. With faith, when Christians are using the word faith, they're just using it under the context of trust, that they trust in the Bible or something like
But you
that. They have
believe the
faith in the
gods
Bible,
exist.
so they're trusting it. And I think that that's a bad narrative when your trust in something is overruling counter evidence. Counter evidence is the issue. That I think an absence of defeaters and an absence of harm is not necessarily a problem, but in presence of defeaters and in presence of harm, that's where you get serious issues.
That's just a God of the gaps argument, though. At that point, you just get to fill in the blank, and that also lets you speculate on the afterlife.
This is absence of defeaters is philosophy. Like if you can hold a position absence of defeaters and also discussing whether or not it's likely, right?
No,
like
you can't just believe
whole...
something because there's no defeaters. That's the invisible unicorn argument. Like, there might be an invisible unicorn right behind me that's only invisible when people look at it, but at all other times is fully visible and staring at me.
And if somebody's... All right, let's go with the invisible unicorn. If somebody's engaging in a religious practice with invisible unicorn because they have experiences with respect to the invisible unicorn, and they're giving offerings to the invisible unicorn that are not something that is going to be substantially affecting their life, they're engaging in that religion in a way that is not harming anybody else, I don't necessarily have a problem with that.
I think
because
they should
in
be
absence of defeaters, in absence of harm, you're engaging in a practice that, all right, fine, whatever.
It's not absence of harm.
Your life, I don't give a shit.
No, it's not absence of harm, though. They live with the constant belief that there's a fucking mystical creature hovering right behind them. This is mental illness. They can't.
If getting into religion as mental illness territory is also not the take. DSM-5 even goes against that.
Well, they're also full of cocks. No.
Right.
The belief that there's that's literally a definition of schizophrenia. The only difference between schizophrenic diagnoses and some religious beliefs is the legitimacy of the institutions they're pulling from. Let's be real. Like, the idea of, like, yeah, there's an invisible, like, spirit hanging around me at all times, like, hovering right behind me. Like, yeah, come on. That would be diagnosable. That would. Even if it's like Yeah, it would. No.
It depends on, like, how it's being approached, right? And I think that I'm not somebody who's familiar with diagnoses process when it comes to schizophrenia. So that's an aspect of the debate that I would just say that I don't know a whole lot on. And I think that what happens with a religious comparison between religion and mental illness is that it takes the stigma against mental illness and applies it unnecessarily onto religion in a way that is engaging in another supremacy narrative. And that's an issue that I have with that kind of approach. There is a video, although by an atheist, if you want to check it out, by Shannon Q talking about this narrative, comparing religion to mental illness, that I advise anybody in your audience to check out. Shannon Q.
Do you think
religion? Please stop calling religion and mental illness is the name of the video.
Do you think schizophrenia is bad? Like,
I think schizophrenia should be treated. If you want, just my. I mean, I'm not against, like, if somebody has a mental illness, they should seek treatment on that.
But how could you possibly differentiate between a person who religiously believes there's the invisible unicorn, blah, blah, and a person who believes it through psychosis?
Again, this is a DSM-5 question. I would consult people that are experts on that issue. As far as, like, how you do it, you know what I mean? Like, we can talk about ethically, because I know plenty of people who are schizophrenic and religious, right? That they're dealing with some kind of psychosis and they're also religious. And there are ways of separating the two as far as, like, how they approach things. And they're on treatment for one, and it helps with the schizophrenia, and yet they remain religious. This is something that I've seen a few times within my community. I think that if you are getting, if you have mental illness and are religious, you should seek treatment for the mental illness. Absolutely.
Wouldn't that potentially just mean that some religious beliefs are just identical to schizophrenia but resistant to treatment?
I think that mental illness can take on religious themes, but that doesn't mean that religion is a mental illness.
Well, I certainly think some things that people believe for religious reasons tend to have them overlapping with diagnosable symptoms of mental conditions, right?
Yeah, just because the overlap doesn't mean that they're the same thing.
No, I don't think
that's getting into correlation causation territory.
I don't think they're the same thing. I just think it's notable. Like, I mean, there have been suicide
you can note it all you want to, but I'd say this is a conversation you need to have with an expert, not me.
Fair. I mean, there have been suicide cults throughout history, but I don't know if you can make an ethical argument against ritualistic suicide if you thought that it was like emboldening
Again,
your
harmful
deity.
practices, man. Is
It's
getting
not
right back. That's
harmful if you think that
Theophrastus.
there's a
If you're
death
harming
god.
yourself with your religious practice,
What if
that's the
they think they'll be
problem.
tortured forever if they don't do it? That's the whole point of hell, right? If they don't do the ritualistic
Then you
suicide.
have we can have a conversation about toxic religions too, right? If you want to have like um a religion that necessitates harmful practices, that's a toxic religion. And again, this gets into that analogy that we were talking about earlier with respect to toxic masculinity and toxic spirituality.
Is it
There are
wrong?
toxic spiritualities, absolutely. There's also toxic masculinity. There's also toxic expressions of a lot of things. But there's also expressions of those things which are not toxic, including masculinity and spirituality.
The difference is, as long as a secular person shares my axioms, I can explain to them how some elements of masculinity are harmful. But if a person has a religious belief in the validity of things they do that are toxic, I can't make that argument against them because
Is
their
the crux of
positions are
this just that
supported from
arguing against
across
them
the
is
moral
hard?
coil. Huh?
Like because again, I've had these conversations with people that like hold a position pretty strongly and still move them away from engaging in harmful practices on the basis of these arguments that I'm giving you.
Okay,
What
at the end of the day,
so I've been
imagine
able to do this,
you can
and
theoretically
you're
you
just
can
saying it's hard, so you don't want to. Like it's just
no
this is really strange.
it's always possible because people are irrational. So even if a person has a logically consistent metaphysical belief in God telling them to kill the whores, you can still pull them out of that if you, I don't know, hit them in the head hard enough or give them ice cream or something. People are weird. It's about the underlying logic. And it's about who you can reform and who you have to kill, right? So imagine your grand poobah of society, okay? The vast majority of people who commit crimes, vast majority, have basically the same axiomatic beliefs as most people, want people to be good and happy. Crimes, they hurt someone, even murderers sometimes. It's like, life is complicated. They can be reformed. And I want that. But some people have axiomatic beliefs that are different. Some people believe on a moral level that it's, say, good to kill certain types of people. Like, on a fundamental basis. Not because they think it'll make society better. Not because they think it'll improve the life of themselves or others. Purely for its own right. It's a separate axiom. These people can't be reformed. They have to be jailed indefinitely, or they have to be executed. It's the only thing you can do. You can hope they'll change, sure. But, well, that's what the indefinite prison sentence is for, right? You see if their cognition shifts. The issue is that religion is like a gigantic other axiom. And while there are people who have that process, whose morals will align with mine, if they end up having a disagreement with me on principal ethical positions rooted in metaphysics, I can't do shit outside of the aforementioned ice cream or hitting them on the head. That's like really dangerous socially. It's dangerous for a person to be able to say, I think we should be able to kill black people, and to have internally a bulletproof, literally unarguable justification for it. You can't argue them out of that position because their position is completely internally consistent. They don't think that because it'll make the world better. They think it because their God told them that's what's right. You can't convince them out of that. You can hit them on the head, or you can give them ice cream. Maybe. That's my
I think
worry.
you're talking about people that are just devoid of ethical concerns. This is not a criticism of religion.
No,
this
they
is
just
a
have
criticism of people that don't have ethics.
No, they do have ethics. They're informed by their God.
Or that maybe they have ethics, but their ethics are malformed in some way.
Right? Okay, like, but the
we're talking about malformation of ethics.
Religion malforms the
you
ethics.
You can criticize those things on an ethical level without saying that, religion bad. Like, because again, this has been a slippery slope conversation where like they have religion, therefore they could XXXX.
No,
and that seems to be the crux of your point.
It doesn't matter even if they don't do that. It's not a slippery slope. It starts at a plateau and stays there. It's being religious opens you up to supernatural arguments. If it starts at the plateau and stays
there, then you have to argue this is a commonality with everybody who's religious at that point, which I don't think that you can do.
No, just because religion necessarily entails a breach in axiomatic vulnerability doesn't mean that unethical behavior will be demonstrated in all of them. It's a numbers game. It's like imagine that you're
basically arguing now religious people can't be ethical.
No, I'm not. It's
okay.
No,
then what are you doing? Because that's what it sounded like.
It's a problem.
So go for it.
It's like having a hole in the house. It's like imagine you took every house in America and you're like, okay, it's bad to have a hole in your roof, like a little hole, maybe the size of a finger, There are
Mhm.
going to be houses that are in great condition that have that hole in their roof. And there are going to be houses in shit condition that have non-leaky roofs. But it's always bad to have the hole in the roof. And sometimes that hole being in the roof means that after a rainstorm, the interior of the house can flood. And that's that. It's always bad to have the hole in the roof. But that's not me saying that, like, it's impossible for a house to be good if it has the hole in the roof, or that it'll always lead to disaster or anything like that. It's just,
Right.
it's a vulnerability that can lead to problems with no potential upside. It's just a bad vulnerability in our cognition. It's just a fault. It's like another cognitive bias, right? Tons of people have basic cognitive biases, like gambler's fallacy or like sunk cost fallacy. We adopt these, we internalize them. It's always bad to have them, but lots of people are fine and successful in spite of having them, right? Like you want to get rid of those. But I can make rational arguments in favor of getting rid of those logical fallacies. The religious thing is self-justifying, which is the real issue.
You can make like rational arguments within religion. I thought we already agreed on that as well.
I mean,
Right. Like it's, and again, making ethical. So when we're talking about like the hole in the building, right? For me, that hole in the building, I mean, I might be looking at it differently because the building for me will be like, all right, here's your spirituality is the building, and the hole in it can be any number of things that allows you to slip in some sort of authoritarianism. And that's where that toxicity is
it's
going
not
to be
about the
of a reasonable
authoritarianism,
discussion.
though.
But you're talking about the house with respect to being like one's worldview, and the whole is going to be spirituality, which allows other things to sneak in, right?
Yeah, because you're
So,
allowing
like, yeah.
superstition to affect your reasoning.
All right. Well, we can call the whole superstition, and then we're going to be more or less on the same page. But superstition, from my perspective, is going to be akin to toxic religiosity.
No, okay, then not superstition. Any religiosity of any, or any
Right. It's a spiritual God belief, that kind of thing.
any
Right.
spiritual, anything,
So,
tarot
yeah, and
cards,
your position is going
horoscopes.
to be that. But that's where we're just going to be disagreeing, because that's we're talking past each other at that point, because you're holding that religion is bad axiomatically, basically.
Yes.
Right. And that's not, I don't think that that's productive. You don't have an argument for that.
But I've been supplying
It's
arguments
just
for that.
axiomatic.
No, it's axiomatic in the sense that it's a defiance of a basic axiomatic principle I hold relating to truth, which is, yes, I believe we should root our beliefs in empirics.
Right. So then it's not an axiom. You're justifying it in some way, but the justification seems to be related always to toxic expressions of spirituality and not spirituality in and of itself.
Not all holes
You're just
in the
blaming
roof
the
lead to
spirituality.
problems. But you never want the hole in the roof, even if it doesn't always lead to the flood.
You're just calling religion the hole in the roof in the
Because
analogy. I think that's disanalogous at that point.
Because you're opening yourself up to supernatural justifications for ethical and empirical positions, which is the problem. So if you open yourself up to that, that is an additional vulnerability. This is like
non-empiricism bad, basically. But in order to get to empiricism, you have to hold non-empiricism positions in the first place.
Yes,
there's a whole conversation in philosophy about how being empiricist only winds up being a self-defeating position. And
but I acknowledged right off the bat, axioms are unjustified.
I'm appealing to that. I'm not trying to get you in a gotcha with that. I'm appealing to that. We agree on that already, right? So when you're saying that, like, the problem with this is that that there's an acceptance of things that are not empirical, we've already agreed that that's a base issue that we all have to deal with in order to explore things in the first place. I think to summarize basically where I'm at on that perspective. I think that if you're going to be engaging with spirituality, there are certain assumptions that you're going to be making about your experiences in order to explore spirituality. People are going to be doing that, and you can engage with that in a healthy way or an unhealthy way. And toxic religiosity is going to be when you're exploring that in an unhealthy way, and religiosity that lives within these ethical constraints, right? Where you're not engaging in your religion in a way that is unethical, is going to be a more healthy manifestation of religiosity.
Well, basically,
and we should be fighting for that and not against everybody who's religious.
It feels like, okay, here's the problem. It feels like you have a bunch of people who are just going about their lives, living a nice secular life, and then you walk in and you're like, I've got a deck of cards right here. Look at this. I will do whatever the deck of cards tells me to do. And it's 52 cards. And 50 of them tell you to do like normal good things. And 2 of them tell you to like rape and murder. And you're like, okay, yeah, and you're just like randomly flipping through them and you just do whatever the cards say. And when people inevitably confront you on the consequences of your newfound life decision, you're like, look, overwhelmingly, these cards tell me to do good things, you know?
Right.
The problem
We
is
should
the
have a conversation
system.
about whether or not those cards should be in the deck at that point. And that's when you get into religious reform.
I don't think you can make that argument with religious people, because once a person believes in the existence of a god, once a person is open to supernatural arguments, they're open to them holistically. If you're religious,
This is a regular argument. This is a regular conversation within heathenry where we're talking about, like, when you get into the Folkus crap, and they're saying that because thing X existed in history with Vikings practicing it or whatever, right? And then they say, because that was the case, we should still be doing it now because we're trying to revive the tradition and act in accordance with it, right? That's an argument that these kind of people will make. However, one of the things that I'm pushing back on that with personally, and I know a lot of other people who do the same thing, are saying, look, just because something exists in history is not justification enough to say that we should revive it absolutely. The people in the past did slavery. Christians in the past did slavery. Vikings in the past did slavery and all that other kind of shit. We can revive the traditions without bringing with it all of its toxic bullshit. So you can remove the toxic bullshit because it's toxic bullshit and continue engaging in the traditions.
Logical. What you're trying to do right now is make a logical argument. The problem is we're talking about religion. It's rooted in irrational
and I have
superstition.
seen effect to it in my activism on that issue.
Yeah, people can be moved, but it's a weakness that doesn't need to exist there. And they move because they move. By the way, they're wrong to do it. If there's a Christian who believes that whites are ordained better than blacks by God, and you convince them that's not the case, they're demonstrating weakness, because metaphysically they have as strong a justification for that position as you do for secular human racial equality. The only real ethical, logical solution to that conundrum should be both of you drawing pistols. But because people are weak and culturally influenced, people with grounded, logically consistent religious arguments for horrible things move over due to peer pressure, which is kind of part of what I want to do, except with all of it. Because I don't think we get any benefits from this particular mode of understanding the world. I don't believe in any of this superstitious stuff, and I don't think you derive any truth from it.
You don't believe... I'm not saying that you need to believe it. I'm saying that if you're going to be criticizing it in a way that is operable to making a movement work,
no, well, this is the
pluralism is going to be the preferable approach of the criticism.
But I'm in favor of including Christians and Jews and Muslims and blah, 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 all the religious people in my...
Which means you should reform to a pluralistic position rather than an anti-theist one anyway, because that's consistent with your goals that you've expressed.
No, again, I believe that people with toxic masculine tendencies should be part of the movement, but I will still criticize toxic masculinity. But all religion is toxic, so...
Right, and pluralism is not saying we need to cast out everybody that demonstrates some sort of non-pluralistic aspect, right? Otherwise, pluralism would just be incompatible with many forms of Christianity. But as long as those Christians who are engaging with a movement are engaging with it in a way that is pluralistic, and that they're respecting others and not engaging in proselytory attitudes, then they're fine. Right? Like that's if they're respecting those boundaries, there's no issue. Just like you're going to be fine with somebody who is expressing toxic masculine traits within your movement, so long as they're not creating victims within your movement.
Well, I don't have an issue with people who are religious in my community. I've gotten emails about that, and I always tell them they're welcome.
Right.
But that's not going to temper my ethical criticisms.
And I've gotten people that are religious in your community telling me that while they appreciate a lot of that kind of, that they're likewise appreciating that, they're also frustrated with the anti-theist thing because it's not necessary. It's wasted energy.
That's fine.
And that's why I'm making the argument for, here is a preferable narrative
I'm sure
for
there
you
are
to be able to
people
engage with.
who are like, I used to like Vaush, but like he was too like, I'm really anti-Semitic, and he was just too not anti-Semitic.
I'm not talking about people like that. What I'm talking about
no, wait,
is people
you are.
You're
talking about people who mostly
talking about people
like
that are
me,
in your community like you and have criticisms. This is very different from what you're talking about.
Yeah,
where it's
people are like,
they hate you now because of whatever.
Vaush was only
I'm not
more
super intimately familiar with your community, but the people that I'm talking about are people that have positive opinions on you, which is the reason why I'm having this conversation in the first place. There's a lot of crossover between us.
I'm not going to cuck myself and pretend that I don't have issues with the consequences of religious thinking because there are people in my community who don't like it. I think
I'm
it's
not
bad.
saying that you should. No, and that's not the argument. The argument is that if you're going to be engaging with this, you should be engaging with it effectively and in a way that is consistent with your positions. And that's why I was saying that you should be against toxic expressions of religiosity and engage in it in a pluralistic narrative, because it is largely the behaviors that you're already engaging with and consistent with your goals in coalition building.
But that would be cucking myself.
Why?
Because I'm not only
it's largely what you're already doing. It's just that it takes away the toxic criticism aspect that hits people that you're on your side. It's not
sure they can be hit. That's fine. No, that's no. You're describing self-cucking here. You're saying, hey, you have a broad criticism, but there are people on that you're getting some friendly fire in your community here, so you should lower it so that you're only criticizing the worst elements of the things you dislike, rather than the whole
simply because you're hitting your allies. If you're hitting your allies on something that is worth criticizing, then that's the toxic masculinity conversation, right? Like that's fine. The issue isn't that. The issue is that you have the opportunity to be able to criticize toxic spirituality and not hit your allies and get the same results. Because all of the criticisms that you've been offering me in this conversation are with respect to toxic spirituality.
No, they're with spirituality in general. And I think that these are the arguments that I want to make. Criticizing toxic religiosity, in addition to being a different argument, and not one that I believe in, would be like super cucked. Like, oh, yeah, guys, I don't have an issue with all religion. It's just like, I don't like it when Christians say other people are worse than them. Mega cucked. I can feel...
Why is that cucked?
Because it's a lie. It's inauthentic. I don't have an issue with just that.
I get that it's not like in line with what your intuitions are currently.
No, that's with my position. No, don't denigrate it. It's not my intuitions. It's my position. It's my ethical framework. And yeah, it's not in line with it. What is your ethical
framework? Okay, all right.
Well, in this case, that religion and supernatural thinking is bad. If I cheapen that, if I'm like, okay, well, I'll only share half my position on this because people in my community don't like it, I feel like I'd be doing them a disservice.
No, that's not the reason. That's why I'm saying that. That's why I'm trying to provide a better argument of like what your position should be given your values.
I don't think
if you're a consequentialist and a utilitarian and you're wanting coalition building, then anti-theism is not consistent with those things.
Okay.
Unless you're just saying, well, it's my position, so I'm just going to fire blindly. At which point, fine. I guess that's what you can do, but it winds up being a bad position that is not in line with your other goals.
Advocacy for coalition building doesn't mean that you can't criticize things in groups that you want to coalition build with.
And I'm not saying you should stop criticizing religion. I'm in fact giving you the ability to criticize religion through other arguments that aren't just religion bad.
I don't believe in. I don't believe in your arguments.
You don't believe you don't believe that harmful practices are bad.
Your harmful practice included ending. Your harmful practice included ending malaria. So no, I don't think we agree on that.
All right.
Well, we have completely different ethical frameworks on top of the religiosity here. But no, it's no argument against religion is sufficient unless it addresses its roots. You might as well be painting over black mold.
Well, yeah, if your argument is against religion broadly, then sure. It's just that within any effective movement, you're going to be having religious people in it. So you should be examining, all right, we have religious people. What makes those religious people a problem? Is there something specific that they do? And it's not the God belief, I think. The thing that they're doing, that when it manifests in something that is harmful, is when you have these supremacy narratives, fundamentalism, extremism, authoritarianism.
Okay.
Right? And when those are manifest within those religiosity, that's when you get toxic.
What you're saying is that you should only be concerned with holes in your roof if you live in areas that have a monsoon season. Like, that's how I feel. I feel like I'm saying, hey, guys, you should have watertight roofs. And you're like, hold on.
It's saying that you can't have like a fundamentalism with respect to like a drizzle. I think that when you get with Christianity, I think that you can have Christians in your movement and still criticize Christianity for its authoritarian tendencies. And I think that you can even find probably criticisms of my own religion if you're going to be operating on that standard, because there are authoritarian expressions of heathenry. And we should talk about those things and we should be finding ways to fight them. But saying that religion bad is not going to be an effective thing in order to lower those toxic behaviors.
Okay, I agree that in terms of reaching religious people and trying them to lower their toxic behaviors, it's not that effective. But again, that's also not my goal. I'm not the kind of... I'm not... There are people out there who are infinitely better equipped to take religious people with toxic beliefs and try to like corral them into a less toxic set of beliefs. But
Mhm.
first of all, I'm not educated on religion at all, so I don't even have the skill set for that. And second of all, it would be disingenuous for me to do that. I would feel like I'm like gritting my teeth and
If you're
leading
not,
people down, like, because I don't want to, like, I don't want to, like it would be like, I feel like I'd be telling people engaging in self-harm, like, hey, maybe try doing smaller cuts and further from the artery. I would feel like I'm cucking myself. I would feel like
yeah, I get that you would feel like that. I'm trying. If you want to get in some education on the matter, I'm happy to help. However, I think that the way that if you're saying like self-admittedly not super educated in this matter, right, and then also engaging in a narrative, well, all of it's bad,
yes.
right?
Mhm.
Like that's a position that you're coming from, admittedly ignorance at that point.
No, I it's like I'm against being stabbed, but I'm not familiar with every type of knife ever made.
Yeah, and that I don't think that I think that's disanalogous
I
because
think
what
it's
we're
perfect
talking
because
we've been talking about like there are productive usages of knives and there are toxic usages of knives, among them stabbing. Okay, and religion is going to be one tool that people use in order to explore the world in themselves, and there are toxic ways of using it. I think that if you're going to build the analogy, it should not be with the action, but with the tool.
I agree that the analogy is not completely analogous, but I stand by the sentiment of the analogy, which is
Right?
that
Is
I
we
feel
can
though my
say
lack of education on the specifics of religion is not related to my broader philosophical issues against it. There's nothing I could learn about religion that would change my mind on this. It's disconnected from that. It's a completely separate issue. I just dislike superstition or whatever you want to, religious thinking, unjustified metaphysical presuppositions, anything like that. Anything like that. But that's the realm of philosophy. Religion is just one way in which people do
I
that.
think you
Technically,
dismissed philosophy like way too quickly, and I think because philosophy is how you combat these problems. And this is what I've been arguing for since the beginning of this conversation, that if you're going to, ethics is a subset of philosophy as well, so is religion, so is science, and so on.
I agree.
Philosophy is a grand, ever touching thing. I saw a funny meme with respect to this. It was like a woman walking like 30 dogs, and it was the woman was philosophy, and then all the dogs were like biologies,
I agree. I have a great
history, blah,
respect
blah,
for
blah.
philosophy. I'm not one of those
Right.
like scientist,
I feel like when you say that's
scientismist.
philosophy, though, it's the sign that you're starting to dismiss it and then move on into another part of the
No, I mean
narrative,
my
which
beliefs are
isn't
rooted
what you
in
should be doing.
philosophy. They're rooted in an anti-metaphysical position. Um,
Right.
but
It's
it's not about
just
the specifics of religion. Like any specific I could learn about religion wouldn't, even if all throughout human history religion had done nothing but good for the world, I would still hold this position. Though admittedly, that would be a very
like that
different
would be
world.
anti-empirical.
Well, no, it wouldn't. No. Okay, wait.
Yes, it
Okay,
would.
no, it wouldn't.
It's
No,
just
you
saying that
still
if
don't
there's no
understand.
examples of this whatsoever, but I'm still going to be
No, it
holding
doesn't.
myself
The
against it.
outcome. We're talking about the. It's process oriented, not outcome oriented.
Right,
Okay.
but that's not empiricism. When I say that it's
Well,
anti-empirical at
I
that
said
point,
it's
it's like there are no examples of this, but I'm still going to hold that
like
it's
I said, it's
bad
a
without
philosophical.
examples. That is anti-empirical.
Well, no,
That's what I'm
it'd be
saying.
philosophical, which is my concern. It's philosophical. The empirics support me in the real world because religious groups tend to do bad things, but it doesn't have to. It's like
I
this.
don't
Would you
tend. All right.
would you rather like a person be your friend because they got a vision from God saying that you should spend time together, or a person be your friend because they enjoy spending time with you?
Honestly, I think the former is a little creepy sometimes.
I completely
So
agree.
yeah,
I actually hold in very low regard people who have religious justifications for not doing bad things. Now, Christians do this the most, not you, pagan, but
yeah.
Christians are like, if you don't believe in God, how do you have morals? The implication of that being that
Right.
they would be
Or
raping
even saying
children
that
if.
I've even seen people say, well, if God didn't exist, I'd just be out doing X crime or whatever the fuck, right?
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
there's clearly some people, and I don't know how to engage with that myself because it's like it does
You
seem
hit
that
them on
there's
the
some
head.
people, well, sure,
You get to
but
them
with
first.
some people, right, it does seem that having some sort of religiosity does prevent them from being fucking monsters. And then on top of that, they seem to be engaging in a religion that has authoritarian leanings at times, like Christianity. And that just, builds an interesting little stack of concerns, right? So, but again, that's if they were engaging in spirituality in a
But
way that
that's an
was a little bit
example
more
of
healthy or
good
something like that,
from a
maybe there's
religious.
something that can be done.
But that's an example of good being done by a religious group that I would actually consider to be philosophically repulsive. Even if the
Mhm.
outcome is good, the process that led to it, rule utilitarianism, blah blah,
Yeah, yeah.
is a destructive one. So you can imagine like a small town in like 19th century America where the church is the center of the community and the church does good, like feeds the homeless, shelters people, like I mean really like good. Like you would look at that and go good. But then it's like they're doing it because they think they'll go to hell if they don't. And
Right.
looking at that, and you can,
Well,
I mean, it can be like a toxic authoritarian, whatever, but looking at that, I'm thinking there are good outcomes here, but there's something about the process they're arriving at that makes me deeply uncomfortable, which is why I say even if religion had only ever led to good things, I would still have these criticisms.
but
Because
you're a
it's,
consequentialist.
I'm a rule utilitarian. I still have to care. So I don't
Okay.
believe this could, well, actually, okay, I
You were
will.
just talking about consequentialism a second ago, and it was just like with respect to the human sacrifice example. And now all of a sudden, the consequence doesn't matter; it's the process that we got there,
Well,
and that doesn't.
I'm okay with the process of sacrificing one person to save like 300,000 people a year.
Uh-huh.
That's a good ratio. Um,
Okay.
but well, no, I mean
Right.
we do this if you take a group of like 20 like West African endemic like biologists or whatever, like some of them are going
I
to die
think
of
that
disease.
my
It's
view, my view of the human sacrifice angle from what you're talking about is similar to what your view is of the good church, right? Like, it just there's something about it that doesn't ring right.
well, that's
Probably
an
in a
outcome
similar way to what you're
criticism
thinking. I don't know why you're
versus
not seeing it on
process
the human
criticism.
sacrifice element, though.
Well, it's
But
an outcome
whatever.
criticism versus a process criticism. Anyway, if religion had only ever led to
You
good
don't think it's a
things,
process criticism of human sacrifice?
no, mine is a process criticism
Oh, it's just utilizing a different criticism. Okay, okay. There
of
would be a process criticism of the human sacrifice thing. It's just that you're not waiting for it, or you're
yeah.
not
Well,
waiting
I
toward it.
guess I mean
Right.
it would depend on like the normalization of that logic. Though it's worth pointing out that if there is a god that can end malaria if you give them one human sacrifice, that might be a god you kind of have to do human sacrifices to. There might be something about that power dynamic between us and that entity that might kind of necessitate that relationship, unfortunately. But
I
again,
view that as a like I don't know. You
well,
get into whether or not you should worship unethical gods or something like
well,
that, and that's a whole nother
at
philosophy.
that point, I mean, they
That's
could
a
crush the world, right? I don't know how much of a choice you get. You're ants in their little ant farm. Past the
at that
point, you
point.
know.
It's since we're not giving human sacrifices in that context, it's clear that that's not the reality that we're living in. Like we're
Mm,
not. That's not a.
well, I'm not
That's
religious,
not where
so I
we are.
agree.
So yeah. I mean, I'm religious, but not in a way that would manifest that kind of conclusion. So
Well,
I
if you
agree with you. You
believe,
could get somebody who's religious to that, but we would be talking about a toxic religion at that point,
but the
in my
Norse
opinion.
literally believed in Ragnarok, did they not?
Complicated question. Probably
Well,
not, actually.
you can't. That's like the one big thing they wrote on. You can't be like, okay, well, we're not going to take that part.
No. All right. So the Ragnarok thing, and we can get into like the ethical concerns of Ragnarok or whatever the fuck,
They're going to kill
right?
all humans in Midgard because they're having a dick waving contest.
Yeah, it seems that the record that that's based on might be a Christian combination of several legends in order to make it agree with Revelation,
Oh, that's
and
convenient.
in order to build, you know what I mean? Like that seems to be what the origination of that legend is, um, because that's like it seems to only pop up in Iceland as far as I've been able to find. The Poetic Edda is the source on that, and it has some weirdness about it.
Well, maybe the Norse should have
Saxo
learned to
doesn't
write.
mention this. A lot of other sources don't mention this. Even Christians that are talking about the way that the Norse practiced and worship. Anglo-Saxon heathenry has zero representation of Ragnarok in it. So it's an outlier, even if you accept it. And if you do, the process of accepting it would have to be ignoring its similarity with Revelation and the fact that Christians were utilizing narratives of saying, look, these other religions are similar to Christianity, therefore that edifies religiosity. They were trying to claim that Odin was, in fact, Jesus trying to reveal himself to the Norse. There's the section of the Havamal that seems to show this, but it could be some Christian interpolation. There's not a lot of certainty around it. Ragnarok could very well be a genuine belief of the ancient Norse, but uh, if it was, it doesn't seem widely held. And whatever that belief actually was is probably wildly different than what we see in the Voluspa. There you go,
Well,
history rant. Sorry.
no, that's fair. I know a lot of stuff got burnt, and the Christians were more keen on writing than the Norse were.
Yeah,
Though,
we have zero records of heathenry from heathens. It's all Christians and Romans, and there's a Muslim as well. A couple of Muslims
should have
that
won the
wrote about them.
civilizational game, I guess.
Yeah, there's a whole fun conversation with respect to records and concluding stuff.
Right.
There's people that will try and say that the Norse gods are the only gods that exist. I think that that's a terrible. There's terrible arguments for that, because if you get into the history argument, heathenry winds up being a weak case. And my most recent video is on that, discussing that aspect. It's just that there are some dumb arguments that people will try and make, and I've made a number of videos countering bad pagan arguments that will show up.
Well, hopefully your
so,
fastidiousness earns you a seat in Valheim.
Or some, yeah, I've been playing a lot of Valheim on stream.
when all's said and done. Well, we have essentially doubled the time I expected us to talk, but
yeah, I figured we'd probably do something like that.
Yeah, we committed a lot of syllables and volume to it. I think I have to yell at my chat for an hour before we can even start up the Metal Gear. I do appreciate you coming on. I've genuinely enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, same. No, it was a good conversation, even if frustrating at times.
Yeah, well, those are the best conversations. You know, I've had plenty of pleasant, completely non-confrontational convos, and I get bored every time. So this is always better.
Cool. And yeah, if you want to do it again, just let me know. We can probably come up with another mode for this conversation or something like that, or specify it in some other way and have something that's a little bit more friendly banter or something like that. Yeah, I can read up on Happy to come on again.
Quran and Hadiths, and I can try to convert you to Islam.
There we go.
We can pray together.
Set the date.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
All right. You as well. See ya.